Good afternoon. Welcome to this session about Minneapolis's new zoning code. My name is Jason Wittenberg. I'm a planning manager in the Department of Community Planning and Economic Development. I'm also joined by Joe Bernard, a planning project manager, and Janelle Widmeyer, a principal planner in CPED. And Shanna Sether and Madel Muta are behind the scenes helping us with the technology today. The city's new zoning code took effect at the beginning of July, following unanimous adoption by the City Council earlier this year. This session, which is intended to last for about an hour, will provide an overview of both the structure and content of the code. Next slide, please. We're recording the session for the benefit of those who aren't able to join the live event today. We'll place the video on the city's YouTube channel as soon as we're able. We're going to set the table with a bit of background, including the timeline and process that we went through over the past several years. We'll then provide a high-level overview of the new zoning ordinance and then get into more specific information that will help you navigate the code when you're working on a project in Minneapolis. Anyone is welcome to attend this session, but we think the content of this particular event is going to be most beneficial for people who work with the zoning code regularly, particularly people who design and develop buildings in Minneapolis, or those who advocate for clients, for example, who design and develop buildings in Minneapolis. It's also on our work plan to work with communities and neighborhood organizations throughout the city to understand the new zoning code and the development review process and how they can effectively engage in that process. We have quite a bit of content today, so we're just going to take questions through the Q&A function rather than verbally. I'll note that all three of us are more than happy to have follow-up conversations with any of you about the code. If we don't cover information that's important to you, or if you want more detail or clarity about any aspect of the code. With that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Joe Bernard to cover some of the background information.
Thanks, Jason. Good afternoon, everybody. As Jason mentioned, we want to start off by recapping how we got here. Prior to 2019, the city spent several years engaging with stakeholders on the future of Minneapolis as part of our comprehensive plan update process. As most of you are familiar, this resulted in the adoption of the city's comprehensive plan, Minneapolis 2040, which then kickstarted a focus by staff on implementing the vision, goals, and policies found in this plan. This work required internal and external engagement and coordination, and culminated in a public review period most recently, and an adoption process of the land use rezoning study that was completed in May. The ordinances we're discussing this afternoon all went into effect July 1st, 2023. Next slide, please. Among other important policy direction, Minneapolis 2040 includes parcel-specific guidance for the size of buildings. We refer to that as built form, and the types of uses that can be established on a given property, which we refer to as land use. Built form includes things like height, setbacks, floor area ratio, and that work was largely completed in 2021. Land use covers the activities that are allowed to take place on a given property and is determined by the primary zoning district applied to that property. The goal of this work was primarily to eliminate conflicts that exist between what our zoning code does or does not allow and what Minneapolis 2040 says should be allowed. This is a problem that state law required us to remedy. Next slide. So as we're doing this work, we asked ourselves the questions on this slide to help bring the project to its conclusion. Were we advancing the goals of Minneapolis 2040 by introducing these regulations? Are we eliminating those conflicts between policy and regulation? Are we making the code easier to use? And of course, we attempted to consider whether or not there are racial equity impacts of the decisions that we were making. Next slide, please. While we want to remind everyone that this final step of this project, the land use rezoning study, created this consistency between our regulations and Minneapolis 2040. There are a number of previous steps that were important that also eliminated conflicts, and that has already been impacting our work and your work over the past several years. First, the inclusionary zoning text amendment that was then followed by the amendment that allowed 3 dwelling units on an individual property citywide. And then the built form rezoning study that came along after that, and also the elimination of minimum parking requirements and our new travel demand management standards that were adopted in 2021. Next slide, please. You see here the organization of the new zoning code chapters. We'll spend some time today talking about where to find commonly used elements of the code that have moved, and of course, highlighting the new provisions that we think are most important. The first thing I'll highlight on this slide here is that there is a new chapter dedicated to defining terms in the code named What Else But Definitions. This essentially serves as a glossary for commonly used terms in the code, and it also includes some useful language, helps distinguish between similar but distinct primary uses, for example. We'll dive into more detail on all of this chapter content in the following slides, and to get that started, I will hand it back to Jason.
Thank you, Joe. As Joe mentioned, we'll now shift to a bit more detail about how to navigate to information that you'll typically need to look for when you're considering a project in Minneapolis. We'll start with looking up the zoning of a property and determining which uses are allowed. Next slide, please. In the upcoming slides, we'll go through this key information just noted here: where to find the zoning of a property, information about all the zoning districts, which uses are allowed, and overlay districts, as well as the built form overlay districts. The city has an interactive map where you can enter any address to find the primary zoning district, built form overlay district, and other overlay districts in one search. The top bullet point is a hyperlink, so we'll send that out and post it on our webpage. Otherwise, you can also Google Minneapolis zoning maps, and the first hit that should be this page with both the interactive map and PDF zoning plates of the entire city. Chapter 545 is probably the largest chapter in the new zoning code. This is where you find the table of allowed uses, regulations for accessory uses and structures, and rules governing nonconformities. The nonconformity rules did not change substantially from the previous code to the current code. Chapter 535 is where you find those overlay districts other than the built form overlay districts, which are found in Chapter 540. And let's go into a little bit more detail. Next slide, please, about each of those. Chapter 530 lists all of the zoning districts, and this is where you can find standards that are unique to certain districts. The highlighted districts on this slide have specific requirements that are unique to those districts, or that are above and beyond kind of the standard requirements. There aren't a lot of district-specific standards. In the commercial mixed-use districts, the standards are primarily about mixed-use mandates in some locations when proposing residential development, and about certain requirements that apply to individual commercial uses that are larger in scale, over 30,000 square feet in area for an individual use. And in the downtown districts, there are specific standards that apply to parking structures, which have been carried over from the previous code, as well as a mixed use requirement in the downtown destination district. I will turn it back to Joe for the next several slides.
Thanks, Jason. Jason mentioned that the new chapter use regulations is has a lot of information in it. There's a lot of information on this slide that we want to make sure that everyone understands. The use regulations chapter is really dedicated to identifying which uses are allowed in which district. As Jason mentioned, that information is no longer found in the zoning district section of the code. Instead, this information is consolidated into this one chapter, so you don't have to flip back and forth between district information to find what you're looking for. What you see here is a screenshot of a new use table. It shows all districts and all the uses that are allowed in each. To navigate it, you need to understand a little bit about how uses are now organized in the code. We have something that's new is we have major headings called groups. The example you see here on this page is the commercial use group. Within groups, you have categories. The ones shown here are bulk goods and heavy equipment sales, commercial agriculture, and commercial recreation and assembly. Each category has a long list of uses that are included within it. Those are detailed in the category descriptions that are found elsewhere in chapter 545, right after the use table. The use table simply shows whether the uses in that category as a whole are allowed in a given district. So if a specific use within a category is allowed in a different manner, so if it's allowed in more or fewer districts than the parent category itself, it is shown as an individual line item here in the table. The table carries some additional useful information. First is that some uses are accompanied by a number. That number indicates the maximum allowed gross floor area of that individual use multiplied by 1,000. So as an example, you can, let's pull out commercial recreation and assembly uses. They are limited to 5,000 square feet because it says 5P, P being permitted, 5,000 square feet in the CM1 district. Okay, the last thing to point out here is that if a category of uses or a specific use is subject to use standards, it will be signified by a check mark in the right-hand column of the table. Those use standards are also found later in the chapter, so you have to refer to those later on in chapter 545, and are specific to given uses or categories of uses. We want to note that those are distinct from development standards, and this is a terminology change in the code. Development standards now refer to requirements that apply more broadly to development in general, and there's a dedicated chapter for that, chapter 550, which we'll go over in a little bit. Okay, next slide. We just want to give you an example here of max GFA for an individual use. Here is how that example plays out for a grocery store. The max gross floor area, again, will be found in the use table, but something else to pay attention to that influences the size of commercial spaces is that we still have these lot area maximums that apply in some of our built form districts. So in this example here, let's say in RM3, you can have a 20,000, you're allowed to have up to 20,000 square feet for a grocery store. However, if you are, that RM3 property also has interior 1, 2, or 3 built form guidance or built form overlay zoning, it might be difficult for you to achieve that maximum GFA because the lot area maximum is making the footprint of your building a little smaller. So just something we want folks to be aware of and pay attention to, that sometimes these regulations have overlapping interests. Okay, next slide, please. Jason also mentioned that we have large commercial uses that have, we've identified those for some new standards in the code. If the proposed use is greater than 30,000 square feet in a commercial mixed use district, you must include facade and public realm enhancements or liner uses. Those standards are all detailed in Chapter 530. Next slide, please. Last thing I'll cover here is that a new provision in the code requires non-residential space and uses in the CM3, CM4, and DT2 districts. These operate similarly to the way the old Nicollet Mall overlay did, and which has been replaced. That's no longer that overlay was removed. These regulations apply in areas of high existing commercial activity and areas where we want to encourage that pedestrian-focused commercial activity in the long run. There are minimum size requirements that apply for these spaces. Only certain commercial uses qualify, but we should say that the list of qualifying uses is quite broad in CM3, and it includes almost all commercial uses. That narrows a bit in the CM4 and DT2 districts where existing commercial activity is the highest. These requirements also come with some design standards and some operational criteria in some cases, so please do pay close attention to this new provision in Chapter 530. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Jason.
Thank you, Joe. Well, the city formerly had 3 industrial zoning districts. There are now 2. They're now called production districts to emphasize the preferred focus on job generating activities where people produce things. In the PR1 district, residential uses are actually allowed as a conditional use. But when developing 20 or more units of residential in that zoning district, there is a requirement to include production space within the development. The production space is required to meet or exceed 15% of the first floor area of the development, though that space is not required to be within the same building as the residential use. It's not a vertical mixed use requirement. And for very large developments in PR1, the production space is capped at 10,000 square feet. You would not be required to provide more than 10,000 square feet of production space in a very large redevelopment in PR1. In the new code, there is not a district equivalent to the former I3 General Industrial District. That was a very intense zoning district, and the reason for omission of a similar district is that Minneapolis 2040 has environmental justice guidance that calls for the city to not allow really intense industrial uses that harm human health. So many of those uses, called high impact production and processing uses, are prohibited from being newly established in the city. Existing ones under state law retain their non-conforming rights and can continue to function. There are certain production uses that are higher impact in nature that were determined to be really necessary to have within the city limits, and those are uses like concrete production, recycling facilities, waste transfer facilities, for example. Those are allowed in the PR2 district, which is only one of 2 zoning districts in the city where residential uses are not allowed. The PR1 district, of course, it generally allows lighter industrial uses that do not have significant off-site impacts. Next slide, please. Partly as an effort to simplify the code, 4 overlay districts were eliminated. The industrial living overlay district was essentially made redundant by the PR1 district that we just talked about. It essentially serves the same purpose as the former industrial living overlay district. The next 2 listed here, the pedestrian oriented overlay district and the West Broadway overlay district, had standards that have been more widely incorporated into the code. Just as an example, some of those districts or sub-districts, as the case may be, had minimum floor area ratio standards that have now been incorporated into built form standards in certain parts of the city. And as Joe mentioned, the Nicollet Mall overlay district has been eliminated because the DT2 district incorporates some of the standards that were in that overlay district. And now I'm going to turn it over to Janelle Widmeyer.
Thanks, Jason. Generally, the built form regulations are going to determine the allowed scale of a building, but lot dimension requirements can also impact if a proposed use is allowed or not. So it's a good idea to check these requirements early on. And lot dimension requirements include minimum lot area and width and maximum lot area. Usually the minimums will have more of an impact on whether or not a use can be allowed. Whether or not lot dimension requirements will apply depends on the type of use, the primary zoning district, and the built form overlay district. We have an example on the slide of dwellings with 4 or more units. This use is almost allowed in every primary zoning district. It's first allowed in the UN2 district. A large percentage of properties that are in UN2 zoning also have Interior 2 built form zoning applied to them. And generally, this use is going to require a minimum lot size of 5,000 square feet and a minimum lot width of 40 feet. However, in the Interior 2 built form overlay district, the minimums increase to 7,500 square feet and 50 feet. Now, if the property is in Interior 2 and also in the Shoreland overlay district, the minimums are 10,000 square feet and 80 feet. So you can see with these requirements, not all properties in UN2 are going to be eligible to have a dwelling with 4 or more units. Next slide, please. Another question that we're going to cover is what can be built on a site at what size? Next slide, please. In answering this question, you'll want to reference the built form regulations in Chapter 540. After the built form rezoning study, there were still some built form regulations located in different parts of the code. Now they are all together in this chapter, with the exception of regulations that are specific to other overlay districts. That's not a built form overlay district. If a property is in another overlay district, especially one that's tied to a body of water, you'll want to check for any built form related standards, since these supersede the built form overlay district regulations. Next slide, please. With the land use rezoning study, there weren't a lot of updates to the built form regulations, but there were some. We'll go through some of the more significant updates, starting with front yard requirements that have been modified. So sometimes a front yard that is greater than the district setback is required based on the front setbacks of adjacent structures. That's often referred to as the established setback or the string test. It used to apply to all built form districts for properties with primarily residential zoning. And now it only applies to properties that are in interior built form overlay districts. So if a property is in a corridor built form overlay district and a residential zoning district, the standard district setback would be the maximum required for the front yard, even if there's an adjacent structure that's set back further. Another change that relates to the front yard requirements is in the higher intensity built form districts from quarter 6 and above, an as of right reduction to the front yard requirement applies when properties are fronting a goods and services corridor. For interior side yard requirements, there are no more graduated setbacks that are based on lot width for dwellings 1 to 3 units. The standard side setback requirements for all uses are based only on the building height. And some other changes were made to permitted obstructions in required yards. We have a few highlighted here. Open porches are allowed to be a little closer to the front lot lines than before. For existing structures, energy efficient wall assemblies, adding insulation to a structure is now permitted. In rear yards that are adjacent to alleys, an electrical transformer is also something that's now allowed. Next slide, please. Some changes were made to the reverse corner yard requirements to make them a little more flexible adjacent to the corner side lot line. A reverse corner lot has 2 street frontages and can have 2 front yard requirements that apply. This image that you see on the slide here has been added into the code to help illustrate the intent of the new text. So starting on the left side of the image, if a reverse corner lot is separated from another property by an alley, the front yard requirement is no longer going to extend across the alley. only a corner side yard requirement applies adjacent to the corner side lot line, just like any other corner lot. Where there's two directly adjacent properties, like on the right side of the image, the required front yard extends only 25 feet onto the reverse corner lot. After that, only a corner side yard is required adjacent to the corner side lot line, extending up to where the front yard is required. Next slide, please. There weren't any updates to the maximum floor area ratio requirements except for the Parks Overlay District requirements. For this district, the FAR maximums were increased for all uses except for 1 to 3 unit dwellings that are located in urban neighborhood districts. Next slide, please. Moving on to minimum floor area ratio requirements. For districts where the minimum FAR requirements apply, an exception was added for existing standalone lots that are less than 5,000 square feet. Those lots are no longer required to comply with the minimum FAR requirements. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Can we go back? I think we are, here we go. This is the one we're supposed to be on. Thank you. This is for minimum height requirements, similar to the minimum FAR requirements. An exception for existing lots was less than 5,000 square feet was also added for the minimum height requirements, exempting those. Another change to the minimum height requirements was made previously to satisfy the minimum height requirement. At least 50% of the building footprint had to comply with the minimum height requirement in all overlay districts where the minimum height requirements apply. Now the 50% threshold only applies in the Corridor 6 and the Transit 10 districts. In all other districts, the minimum height requirement is met if any portion of the building complies with the minimum height requirement. This change was made to ensure that the ordinance didn't create an issue for larger projects that meet the intent of the ordinance and the built form guidance of the comprehensive plan, but didn't meet the letter of the ordinance as it was written. With that, I'll be turning it back over to Jason to cover the next topic.
Thank you, Janelle. Let's go over some other requirements to be aware of. Next slide, please. Joe had covered Chapter 545 use regulations. That chapter also has standards for accessory uses and structures, as well as legal nonconforming uses and structures. Chapter 550 has development standards for a wide range of uses. And Chapter 535 includes the overlay districts, and we'll go through each of those in more detail now. Next slide. Accessory structures for single-family homes, duplexes, and triplexes, the maximum size of accessory structures or garages has increased from 676 square feet to 800 square feet. That also includes accessory dwelling units, which now can have a larger footprint than they previously were allowed. Larger lots can benefit from a provision that allows accessory structures to cover 10% of the lot area. There used to be a cap of 1,000 square feet in those situations, but that has now gone away. Of course, you still have to meet the lot coverage and impervious surface standards for the overall property when taking advantage of more flexible accessory structure lot area standards. And I think I turn it back to Janelle now with the next slide.
We wanted to highlight some changes to the general residential standards that are found in Chapter 550. First, the minimum dwelling unit size has been standardized. A minimum of 300 square feet is required for all dwelling unit types, and that includes studios, efficiencies, dwellings with 1 or more bedrooms, and accessory dwelling units. We had 3 different size minimums before. Now it's all the same at 300 square feet. Another significant change applies to how many principal residential structures can be located on a zoning lot. Previously, there was a limit of one principal residential structure that applied per zoning law in all zoning districts. Now there is no restriction in the CM3, CM4, downtown, and PR1 districts. A proposal can just include multiple structures in those districts. The limit does still apply in the urban neighborhood, residential mixed use, CM1 and CM2 districts, except in the case of a planned unit development, a cluster development, or a common lot development, which is a new use in the zoning code. We don't have time to go into detail about these three uses that allow for multiple principal structures, but we wanted to briefly describe common lot developments and give an example of what that proposed use might look like. Next slide, please. So common lot development is a permitted use that's limited to two principal structures with and only residential uses are allowed in the structures. The example shown on this slide was approved as a cluster development with 4 units in the structure on the right and with 1 unit in the carriage house on the left. Under the new rules, this proposal could be approved as a common lot development without needing to obtain a conditional use permit. So this example included existing structures, but a common lot development could also include new structures. We're working on a handout that will include a comparison of these 3 uses to help determine what would work as an option for different development proposals and potential advantages or disadvantages of pursuing one option over another. Next slide, please. If there's a proposal for a non-residential use that includes any functions that are not enclosed in a building, you'll want to reference the enclosed building requirements, which have been primarily compiled in one section now. They used to be spread across all different districts. In general, all non-residential activity is required to be enclosed. Exceptions to this rule that apply to more than one use, like outdoor dining, children's play equipment, and outdoor storage, are included in this section in Chapter 550. More exceptions to this provision have been added than were allowed before. We don't have time to get into all those. But one other thing we want you to be aware of is that there are some other exceptions that are tied to specific uses, and those are included in the Chapter 545 use standards, or in some occasions in a uses definition. And we'll go to the next slide, and I will be turning it back to Jason.
Thank you. And just a reminder that if you do have questions that come up during the presentation, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A. You don't have to wait until the end of the presentation to do that. Let's take a look at a few site and building design requirements. Next slide, please. Site plan review standards are now in Chapter 550. They are not part of a standalone chapter any longer. Fence regulations also in that chapter. Chapter 555 includes parking, loading, and mobility standards. We largely overhauled that chapter in 2021. Did not change substantially, although there are some key changes that we'll talk about. Both off-premise and on-premise signs are now consolidated into Chapter 560 and overlay districts in 535. Next slide, please, to get into more specifics. We didn't comprehensively overhaul site plan review standards at this point. There are a few things that have become more flexible, however, in the site plan review regulations. We reduced minimum window requirements pretty substantially when facing an on-site parking lot. Residential structures formerly automatically had a trip to the Planning Commission with a public hearing at 10 units. Now that threshold is 20. So if a project includes no other land use applications other than site plan review, so no variances, no rezoning, etc., and it's up to 20 units, up through 19, it can be considered administratively by the staff. And then many of you are aware that we have historically in our site plan review standards had a maximum setback of 8 feet in non-residential zoning districts. A bit more flexibility was added. That's now a maximum of 15 feet in those districts. Next slide, please. And now I'll turn it over to Joe.
Just a few parking related tweaks that we want to cover here. There is a new development standard. So this is in Chapter 550 that makes clear that surface parking is not permitted between a principal structure and a front or corner side lot line. There is some language here that provides some flexibility. However, if this is an existing condition that you have on site and you need to improve the parking area. Next slide. I think we mentioned that the PO overlay district has been removed. This is an example of a provision that existed in the PO overlay before, limiting surface parking frontage on a street to no more than 40 feet. Again, formerly in the PO district, now it applies more broadly and is a standard that is required in all of our commercial mixed use districts and downtown districts. So not a new one, but just a different geographic application. Next slide, please. Finally, I want to point out that authorized variances for parking, loading, and mobility standards have all been combined into one authorized variance that captures most elements in the chapter, save for the two items noted here about location of offsite parking and our TDM regulations. We also want to make sure to quickly note that we've mentioned a couple times that there's been a major overhaul to parking and TDM regulations that happened a couple years ago. I think most folks are aware of that, but I do encourage you to review those highlighted items here on this slide if you're not already familiar. Okay, back to Jason.
Thank you. We'll review a little bit about application requirements that are applicable to different situations. Next slide, please. Chapter 525 is now called Administration and Procedures. I think it has a lot more clarity than the previous code about the different decision-making processes and who is invested with the authority to act on different applications. We codified a standard also that was previously a practice where if a project was denied, the exact same project could not be resubmitted within 1 year. A project that differs substantively in some way can be submitted essentially immediately. And I think there will likely be a fair amount of flexibility in how that is interpreted, but clarity again about a decision-making process being final is in 525.90. Some of the application findings have been modified. Two of the standards for changes of non-conforming use were amended. One of the findings for conditional use permit has been updated. I believe that is related to traffic congestion and curb cut interface with the public right-of-way. One of the findings for expansion alteration of non-conforming uses was modified. Variance findings, the language has been amended a bit to clarify what practical difficulties means. And then a bunch of authorized variances have been combined into a single authorized variance, excuse me. There had previously been many parking and loading related variances that are now in a single authorized variance. Next slide, please. Clarity was added about the process for amending the maps in the comprehensive plan. And clarity was added that we do not accept applications to amend the text of either the comprehensive plan or the zoning ordinance. We, in cities of the first class in Minnesota, still have a statutory requirement that when rezoning from a residence district to a commercial or industrial district, consent signatures are required in order to proceed with those rezoning applications. There's clarity that the UN and RM districts are essentially residential districts for that purpose, and the others, CM, DT, PR, and TR, are commercial districts that require signatures when going from one to the other. We still have restrictions on split zoning and assembling property in different zoning districts into a single lot without rezoning. However, some clarity was added about public parks being allowed to have multiple zoning districts on a lot. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it over to Janelle to cover available resources.
Next slide, please. We just wanted to highlight and identify some of the resources that are available online or will be online soon. Some things are still in process. Starting with maps and data, there's the address lookup app. That's the interactive map that was referenced earlier in the presentation. Like Jason had said previously, you can find all the zoning for properties on that app. The zoning plates are still in the process of being updated. There is primary zoning data that has been published on the city's open data portal. That's available now as well. The new zoning ordinance will be published on Unicode. Unicode publishes the city's ordinances, and unfortunately, it may be a month or more before that is available online. So for now, we have to use a PDF version, and the link is provided here. Handouts that are helpful resources are also provided online, the first being the Land Use Handbook. It has information about each of the districts, including applicable standards. This handout includes a diagram that explains how to use the use table. And then for each use group, there's a page on the handout that includes that use group section of the table, the description of the use group, and then descriptions of the use categories within the use group. So you can reference it all in one page, and you don't have to flip back and forth between the different sections of the code. Another resource is the Built Form Handbook. We first created these after the Built Form rezoning study was adopted. We're in the process of still updating these, given some of the changes that have occurred, but those updates should be completed within the next couple of weeks. This handout includes a page for each district with the requirements applicable to that district, and it's just a really helpful tool to reference without, again, having to look through multiple sections of the code. And then lastly, the application forms are all updated and available online. Next slide, please. For those of you who are proficient in finding things in the old code, this quick reference guide for where ordinances were relocated may be helpful to you. It's organized by chapter, and it lists where different parts of the code were moved. Next slide, please. This is just a continuation of that quick reference guide. We will post the presentation on the Minneapolis2040.com website. That was that link was put in the Q&A. Excuse me, Q&A of this meeting. So you can just link to that. We'll have it posted there shortly, and you can refer back to any of this information. Next slide, please. And now we'll be moving on to questions that have been entered in.
It looks like there was a question about the hyperlinks. As Janelle noted, we will post this presentation on the Minneapolis2040.com website, link provided there in the Q&A. So those hyperlinks will be available. It did not look like we were able to attach the actual slides to the Q&A, the limits of our technology here. I do not see other questions in the Q&A. We'll maybe give a moment here for others to pop up. Otherwise, just to emphasize again, when you're assigned a planner to work on a project in Minneapolis, they will continue to be great resources. Keep in mind they are still learning this material. It's a big transition for them as well. But Janelle, Joe, and I are more than happy to talk about any of this material by phone, by email, what have you. We're happy to communicate about any of this, questions that you have, looking for more clarity. We'll even entertain suggestions that we should have done things differently for future reference. But again, can't emphasize enough that we are happy to be resources for this transition to a new zoning ordinance. It's kind of something that doesn't happen very frequently. Our last major overhaul was in 1999, and it's the city's fourth zoning code in its history. So this is, again, not something that happens every day. I'm not seeing any other questions pop up. So with that, I think we will conclude, and again, look to this on the city's YouTube channel. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us.
Jason, we do have a question in the Q&A that just popped up of what triggers a travel demand management plan.
Oh, thank you. Joe, do you have that memorized more than I do? We have major and minor travel demand management plans now. We have attempted to make those less of a negotiation and more of a predictable. If you provide these features, your travel demand management plan is generally approved. But I may have to defer to Joe on the exact triggers of those if you've got that handy, Joe.
I don't off the top of my head. It's been a couple of years since we worked on this, but I can't remember the specific triggers. But the major takeaways from that change is that we no longer require a traffic study in most cases with a TDMP now. And that there's a more of a clear-cut transactional arrangement here where you provide TDM strategies in exchange for getting an approval, and those strategies might be limiting your vehicle parking or having a transit fare subsidy or improving the pedestrian environment around your project.
I've pulled that ordinance up, and so there's a table that includes all the uses and development that would trigger a TDM, and it explains which one to trigger, minor versus major. But generally, if you have 50 or more residential units or rooming units, that would trigger TDM. Any expansion of a building that's 25,000 square feet or more would be a threshold. Let's see. And if the use is a reception or meeting hall containing 5,000 square feet or more of new or additional gross floor area is another trigger. And then shopping centers as well, containing 10,000 square feet or more of new GFA. And then there is a discretionary one, I think that was mentioned.
Thank you for pulling that up, Janelle, and that is table 555-10 within the zoning code where those triggers can be found. Thank you for that question. And now with that, not seeing others, unless someone sees any others popping up that I'm not seeing, I think we will go ahead and conclude.
Sorry, Jason, there was one that just popped in too that says, can you reshare comments about the changes to comp plan amendments?
Certainly, the zoning ordinance now includes more clarity about the process for amending the comprehensive plan. When you apply to amend either the future land use map or the built form map, and then as has always been the practice, it was codified that the city does not accept applications to change the policies, the text within the comprehensive plan. And it looks like that was on slide 39 for when we send that back out. So thank you for that. Now I'm reluctant to conclude the meeting because every time I do, and another question pops up, and that's good. More questions, the better.
I'm not seeing any more questions now either.
Okay. Thank you, Shanna. All right. Thank you, everybody. Much appreciated.